start off with, I just wanted to give some background to my own involvement in Botswana, which has been as an environmental consultant, starting off in the 1990s, late 1990s. And my core business is I'm a freelance consultant. I could do consulting work to government, NGOs, private sector, and mostly to do with community-based resource management and tourism planning, wildlife management, and one of helping communities to empower themselves by developing their own land use plans. And the precursor to those plans are usually participatory surveys. So I picked up quite a lot of experience over the years mapping traditional territories of the San, in particular wildlife conservation, and I'll explain a bit later with the other slides how all of that is done. Now what makes Botswana quite globally significant is the extent of untransformed and unfragmented habitat that it has relative to other parts of Africa. So it's really, Botswana is really the core, and our focus is that red circle area. That's our main project focus, which is northwest Botswana. Privatized development of cattle posts, and some of those are impacting on some of the sand communities who traditionally use those areas. So those are becoming increasing pinch points for wildlife and connectivity challenges. You can see the red lines in northern Botswana. Those are the veterinary fences. That doesn't show all the veterinary fences in Botswana. It just shows those veterinary fences within the blue outlined area, which is that represents the northern Botswana contiguous habitat area. There's a lot more fences. And the good thing in a way is that the veterinary department are coming to terms with the practicalities of fencing and just how redundant they've become. The elephants move across these artificial boundaries regardless of these veterinary fences. And the veterinary officials of the department are working towards other solutions related to foot and mouth disease, such as treating meat, preheating it to kill FMD, which doesn't require separation of infected and non-infected zones. Sadly, there's been a loss of up to 90% of the large ungulate biomass in the Kalahari relative to the 1970s. The late 1970s was a peak rainfall period. That's when wildlife numbers were at their greatest, and that was followed by a drought coupled with newly erected fences, which caused an absolute population crash. It wiped out in the space of about 4 or 5 years hundreds of thousands of wildebeest and hartebeest in the Central Kalahari, and that population has never recovered ever since. This fence is actually on the western border, northwestern border area of Namibia. Now, the significance of the San is that they represent mankind's oldest genetic lineage, and they've been proponents of territorial-based rotational burning, early burning, for tens and tens of thousands of years. So that is actually, in addition to like bow and arrow hunting technology, this early burning is perhaps, in terms of that as a traditional ecological, traditional skill, this is perhaps the oldest representation of that, for many tens of thousands of years, perhaps older than the indigenous people in Australia in terms of the length of time that it's been used. And the extent of that anthropogenic effect on the landscape extends not only in Botswana, but right across the Southern African landscape, even into the Nyomba woodland in Angola. So, obviously, there's been a lot of change since then, which I'll explain a bit later. This slide just shows really how everything is connected back to Africa. You know, our common ancestors lived in Africa, and humans have spread from a common ancestor that lived somewhere in East Africa approximately 150,000 years ago. And when it comes to the San, they're the earliest branch in the human family tree. So if our common ancestors somewhere here, they're the first branch from that common ancestor.
Oh. Oops. When you touch the screen.
Okay. Okay. So that's also quite interesting. There's pictures of Jintwasi, so the group that Dom comes from, and they actually buy a tree waterhole. So this is a Mongongo tree. These trees are very important. They produce edible nuts, which constitute about 70% of their diet. And a lot of the trees are hollow, providing water as well. Now with the Jintwasi, and this is the same for most San groups all over the country, there's about 33 different dialect groups. So there's 3 main language groups of San, and there's a total of about 35 dialect groups. So it's quite diverse. Nowhere near, I think, the diversity of languages in Australia, but the landscape here is a lot smaller. And so the Jintwasi use well over 120 species of plants, and they're mostly edible tubers. So here they're digging up Vigna. It's a genus, different species, which typically ripen from April onwards. And at that point, the above ground portions of the plants are dormant. So early burning is quite a good way of doing things because it does the least possible damage to these plants at the time and many others. Most of the energy reserves have been mobilized towards the center of the plants where they can't do much damage. And in contrast, in October, November, a lot of the plants start to activate their meristems, so they're very, very sensitive to fire, even before rains have started. So if you have any fire taking place, it does a lot of damage. And usually with the first rains, plants like these will sprout very, very quickly. So again, that's one of the reasons why it's not adapted to later burns. Bow and arrow hunting, it's been going on. They use poisoned arrows, and this technology has been used for tens of thousands of years. This is quite an interesting one. This is a site in the Okwa Valley in central Botswana, where there's these rock engravings in this rock, which have been used by the Ko San Kong for a very, very long time to sharpen spear points and arrows. And it's taken hundreds and hundreds of years to create those grooves. And the interesting thing is we had elders explaining how those were used, who they were actively using those. Their own family members were actively using those. So that's a direct link between something that could be regarded as almost like a Stone Age artifact, a direct linkage to living people today. These are the participatory surveys that we do a lot of. So this is in an area called GH10, to the west of the Central Kalahari Game Reserve. And these are very valuable processes because they really galvanize the support of local people. Because the San identify very strongly with their territories, and because the focus is on the territorial resources, that's a way of really pulling them in. So it's very valuable as a mobilizing force. And of course it allows them to take ownership of their planning processes so that they feel like it's their doing. It's not someone else coming in and generating a plan for them. In this case, we did schematic territorial mapping, and that led to extensive surveys across vast tracts of land using donkeys to gather data with the elders, and we had these strategic water drop-off points to supply those teams. So this is something that Sofaka was also quite involved in. That's him over there. So he's helping the elders to superimpose locations of key resource sites on mapped locations that they can identify with. So the thing is, these territories are split up into subunits of land. So you can have, up like 150, 200 subsections to a territory, and each section has its own unique characteristics and its own unique identifying name. So when they build their collective mental map, they're always referring to known sections of land, and that's how they build up a sort of a mental database of information in reference to this geographic spatial system, and all the planning flows from that. So they plan strategic use of their resources, and including how they burn, well in advance. And the interesting thing, of course, is that they have a strong concept of sustainability and the limits of what those territories can sustain in terms of human population numbers. So in GH10, we have a mixture of 4 different ethnic groups in the same area. And those boundaries were very clearly defined. They have very strict rules about rights to use resources, and that has developed over time really as a sustainability requirement. And typically as bands traditionally, they would disperse and aggregate, depending on the seasons and availability of water and plants. Now, the significance of this is that this is in a particular area which has been identified for ranching development, which is causing a lot of distress amongst the local inhabitants because it impacts on their land use plans, their tourism plans. So that is a very contentious issue at the moment. Now, what would be regarded as the most viable habitat for fires, northwest Botswana is one of them. It's got the high fire frequency that the fire people are looking for. These are all areas that where really because of the people now living in settlements primarily, it's kind of weakened their occupancy and use of these areas. So as you will know, early burning has been stopped. There's a fear about lighting fires. There's some apprehension about being arrested as poachers, in inverted commas, if they go into those areas. And there's also been a massive reduction in wildlife biomass. So because of the loss of bulk grazers, zebras, buffalo, that has also had an impact in not, helping to reduce fuel loads. So that's part of the reason why we have this huge problem with wildfires in this part of the country. here the Jutwasi are digging up a plant. It's a Diospirus genus, and these plants are very valuable because they fruit in December and they flower in September. So they're very important, and here's an example of a burn that just went through. This was in November, and it completely just fried the plant, the flowers, the fruits, so that's a lost edible resource. This is also from northwest Botswana, which shows some of the structural damage to vegetation from wildfires. Here's an example of well-burned felt. So this is an area where the communities have actually been able to implement early burning, and you can see it just looks better. It's more productive, there's better grass, better structure, much more diversity. Okay, key challenges. There's obviously a problem with the settlement-based dependencies and social welfare programs, which erodes the traditional ecological knowledge, access to territories, and also to some extent exposes the territories to other threats from unsustainable land use. Very often you'll have situations where people together in these settlements, there tend to be ethnic conflicts between different groups with different competing interests. The CBNRM program in Botswana is very well intended, but very often doesn't take cognizance of some of the socioeconomic realities and hierarchies. So very often trusts don't work because it's got competing ethnic groups in the same trust. And you'll find that the San don't identify at all with the people with farming cultural background. And that leads to massive problems in terms of the ability of those trusts to operate. In NG3, we've unfortunately experienced very little support from the Wildlife Department in implementing the human-wildlife conflict mitigation. We found that there's been a preoccupation with trophy hunting at the exclusion of other very important and I believe more important aspects of community-based resource. So there's really a need to rebuild those relations with Wildlife Department and to make them more pragmatic, science-based, and more meaningful to the people involved. Okay, lack of resourcing. So that's always a big problem. How do we resource our programs? How do we get them off the ground? That is a major problem, and the carbon market seems to be a good opportunity if we can tap into that. The land tenure system is still very farming centric. Hunting and gathering is not recognized as a valid form of land use. In the tribal areas, you can only really apply it to develop cattle posts. So there's often a problem like in the land boards, where very often the people in the land boards tend to favour allocations to people that they identify with. Loss of biodiversity and plant productivity, so that's related to the absence of early burning, and underabundance of wild herbivores.
And in those patrols, they survive on food rations and wild foods. Record all intersections with large mammals and spores. So whenever they walk across, they check ground and spores. Whenever they see them, they record them. And sometimes the average minimum distance per day is 10 kilometers. So there they are in the bush walking. That's how we walk in the bush. Culturally, we follow each other. So we make one line in the bush. Then they are recording their findings. And also there, trying to identify what came to drink there.
just explain some of those outputs in this line.
Yeah, like here we have outputs, decline in poaching. Whenever we walk in the bush, then sometimes if the poachers see our spoor, they don't come to those areas because they will fear that they will be caught. So, and it is also improved, there is improvement in biodiversity and improvement in human-wildlife conflict, traditional ecological knowledge, revival and transfer, promotion of identity and sense of well-being and health through activities and employment. Land occupation and organization to count land grabs and destructive land use. Empowerment and creation of sustainable income, generation opportunities, ideal platform for integration of academia. So those are some of the outputs in this case. And we also have this wildlife, human-wildlife conflict mitigation water point, where we water elephants to keep them away from the community, from people. And they've done a lot of damage. So this is where they take down the panels. They're struggling to fix the water. Role of remote wildlife goal in mitigating human-wildlife conflict and adapting to efforts, effects of human-related disruption to traditional wildlife dispersal and climate conditions and droughts and more frequent when droughts in our areas. So you find that there's a room around the community. So having the event out there helps reduce that. You see, the water was low and all over, and there those guys, the ranger, the patrol team, and fixing water. The pipes were broken, the workers come and they pull out the pipes. The water is short and then the effort will all over and trying to help them. Secular patrol around wildlife borehole at 80 meter to 150 meter around water outlet points. And to survey around to the water points, because sometimes they drink, there is a congestion, there is traffic, so you need to go further around the water point to identify spores. Botswana-Namibia border is down as you see it. Wildlife movements across the state, historically importance of due crossing of free movement. So we always divided by fence there. There are due cross on the other side in Namibia and the other side in Botswana. And in Namibia they practice fire management already. So we are one and the same. These are some of the problems we encounter. First, taking down animals. Some of our teams came across that. Oh, nice. And wild dogs in those areas are plenty. You see them running around. The babies and the elders, these are young ones running around the money shore. Potable rain harvesting, coping with effect of climate change, logistically support to remote range teams, ranger teams. Traditional community tourism activity, get this in place to collect water, rainwater. So that flood is meant to collecting sheets, collect rainfall water and transfer into that other container that is buried on the ground. And it carries the capacity of 2.5 liters. 2.5 thousand liters. And those is rough government Kaudum. Because in Kaudum National Park in Namibia, they also practice, that's where they also undertake their elephant activities up in the northern side. As you can see that in the map. So sometimes those fires come down to other areas. But they're very clever because they already experiencing what is happening. Now you guys, you can read like I think that's read what is happening there. We have all the locations. Saying NG3, NG2, NG1, those are some of the areas that we really focus on. Those are the control, the hunting areas and the boundaries. So those in control that divide us. Do you have something to say?
No, I just need to do some explanation.
Okay, thanks.
Thank you. That's fine. Yeah, thanks, Doctor. So the yellow boundary indicates the extent of the patrolling area. So it's quite a large chunk of landscape that they patrol. So what we're quite interested in, because we've got a pool of about 25 to 30 guys who work rotationally in these teams. So what we're very interested in is how we can use these teams to penetrate these areas at low cost to do early burning. Because you don't necessarily have to use helicopter, because if the guys are going into these remote areas where there's no vehicles, there's nothing, no developments at all. It's a very low cost way of implementing early burns. And this shows the extent of some of the surveys in one year. That was from January to September 2023. They've been doing this continuously since 2019. So there's a huge amount of data that's been collected all the time related to that. And also, if we do implement early burns, they can also take advantage of these patrols to do environmental monitoring, to measure the responses and changes in biodiversity once early burning has been implemented. These symbols are just short, like codes for animals that they've seen. So G is Gemsbok, E is eland, EL is elephant. So that's an indication of some of what they've seen. And we basically have mapped that data. We've only analysed about 10% of the data that we have, and we don't have the resources to continue the process. But this, we're able to map density gradients, so along these patrol lines, and these patrol lines can change. They don't have to be the same routes at all. We go wherever we instruct them to go. That gives an idea on wildlife densities along these gradients, and from that we can see, okay, how is distribution, abundance and diversity changing relative to where people are staying and relative to whatever land use activities are taking place. So again, with the early burning stuff, that's a way of also measuring wildlife responses to the early burns. There's a whole lot, these just show different species. And this is along the fence line, so what we did is we've measured the percentage of contacts that wildlife make with fences that result in crossings as opposed to deflections. So, for instance, with kudu, I've included the same. Okay, so with kudu, the blue line, 37 out of 72 fence contacts were successful crosses of the fence line in one direction or the other. And the proportion is highest with elephant, because elephant can walk over fences. It's lowest with, some of your smaller antelope, like roan antelope and pursebuck. They have a lot of trouble crossing. What we found is that the permeability of these fences is increasing all the time as the fences become progressively degraded through the action of elephant. And the interesting thing is the veterinary department recently, they held Kotla meetings with the communities and said, guys, we can't maintain the fences anymore, we don't have the money for it, and you're on your own. So they've now are effectively abandoning some of these fences, which is a good thing for wildlife connectivity, and it's not really that important for disease control anyway. This shows some of the potential fire areas that have been identified. So the pink area is the Tsodilo project area. That shows the potential extent of that project area. So it's not currently using the full extent of that potential area. These zones show what's feasible in terms of the people that live there, in terms of the traditional land use dynamics, in terms of how the areas relate to neighboring groups. This will give you an idea on the possibly viable areas in which to implement other savanna fire project areas beyond the pink area, which is with Tula Hill. So possibly these ones here as well. And they have to correlate very closely to, obviously, to high frequency areas. So what have we learned? There's obviously huge potential for early burning to address biodiversity, financial sustainability problems, to revive traditional environmental knowledge, ecological knowledge, and to integrate that into contemporary planning processes. I mean, you can see it's very well developed in Australia. It's almost like you almost have pro forma systems now in place to be able to get these things going and in place. And it's very impressive to see the high degree of autonomy of local people, in terms of how much they can get involved in decision making around resource use and the respect that they have for their traditional knowledge systems. So number 3, there's obviously big potential, commercial potential and potential for stakeholder cooperation and support, globally with this thing, which is quite encouraging. And of course, we see the great value and potential in Botswana, because in terms of how this early burning can restore the ecological processes, biodiversity, and just the productivity of these landscapes, because these vast areas have become quite, in a way, sterile and not really productive. And just through this corrective habitat burning, a lot of those edible plants will become much more productive, and if we can help people gain access to those, immediately that's a health benefit, because they're otherwise dependent on a very, very limited diet available in the settlements through the social welfare programs. So it really does make a lot of sense to promote access to these territorial areas. And of course, Botswana does have a great advantage because it's got vast tracts of landscape, it's got lots of space, low population, so there's a lot of potential for catering to, mitigating conflicts where they occur and catering to the needs of all interest groups without standing on each other's toes. Questions to be answered. So perhaps one of the first ones from our point of view is, how can we as stakeholders government, NGO communities, how can we access resourcing and investment to really set up and strengthen these community-based initiatives? Because they're important precursors to the early burning, and they are also quite time sensitive because some of them are affected by land pressures. We can't really just, they're starting to gain traction. We can't take those initiatives and shelve them and keep them on ice for 3 years until until they're more ripe for activation with the carbon markets. We need to really just push the development of these areas now to strengthen them in preparation for that. And we're also concerned at the very limited constraints that there appear to be in what is considered, a threshold for economic viability for fire project areas. So how can we combine areas? How can we subsidize maybe from more productive fire areas to help the areas with less fire frequency? My colleagues are very concerned about Central Kalahari, which doesn't have the fire frequency that is of interest to carbon fire people. How can we supplement and subsidize and come up with sort of a diversified approach so they can still have early burning programs and still get the support that they need. There needs to be much more detailed research on the hunter-gatherer land use systems, because there's a lot more detail that we can go into to understand those human-plant fire dynamics and interactions, because I believe that that's really important to get to grips with in order to find how best to integrate that with the economic and scientific considerations. And of course, number 5, the Botswana land tender system. Really that needs to be developed so that over time, that's obviously something for government to deal with, but it does have good policies in place, such as the remote affirmative action policy for remote area dwellers, which recognizes the disparity with certain groups and the difficulties of some sectors of the economy, the population, in terms of accessing resources and opportunities for sustainable development. So, sorry for the length of time, but thanks for your patience.